Pandemics in American history. I don't know about you, but I think I've heard the word pandemic more times in the last 3 months than in the last 30 years. I must be missing something. Let's think. First of all, what's the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic? I keep hearing those two words being thrown around. People like, especially early on, COVID-19, they were arguing about which it was. What's the difference? Well, an epidemic is a spike in the number of cases because of disease beyond whatever is quote unquote normal in a geographic area. So you can have epidemics within a town, you could have an epidemic in a county, in a state, in a country, in a continent. It's just whatever's over usual. Um, on the other hand, a pandemic is when an epidemic spreads across several countries around the world, causing widespread illness and death. That's what we have going on right now. So it got me thinking. I mean, how many pandemics do you think there have been in American history? And that's the key here, right? American history, because what we're not talking about the bats, okay? We're not talking about SARS from about 20 years ago. We're not. Oh, that's cute. We're not talking about the swine flu. We're not talking about the avian flu. We're not talking about the Zika virus. We're not talking about MERS. These are all pandemics from the last 20 years or so, but they were worldwide pandemics that really didn't affect the United States too much statistically. For anybody who's individually hurt, obviously it's a tragedy. So again, how many American pandemics do you think there have been? I mean, by now you've probably have heard of the Spanish flu, even if you hadn't heard about it before. So there's one. Smallpox, especially if you're Native American or if you're interested in colonial history or Native American history, you know it's a huge thing, right? But what else? Tuberculosis? Yeah, that's right. Polio, cholera in this country, HIV/AIDS. It's a pandemic, but I don't know if we often think about it that way. Measles. I got a shot for that. I didn't know that was okay. But there's more. And if you didn't catch it, I slid in the plague there. I don't know how that slipped. That we had the plague here in the United States. Yeah, we did. We've had it a couple of times actually. Um, so altogether, we've had a number of pandemics. Although to be fair, the plague is just a really interesting story. It's probably more of an epidemic than a pandemic, but we'll get there. Yeah, I had no idea. Huh. Kind of got me thinking, like, with these pandemics, like, what's the cause and the effect? Like, is this normal? Is it strange that we're getting one now, or have we been lucky that we haven't had them in a while? I don't know. Um, well, things that can affect the spread of disease are human interaction, right? Biomatter transfer, and just with population growth, the more people are going to come into contact with people. And then weather and changes in weather can disrupt um, diseases and their habitats and spread them, as well as changes in weather, but not the way you might think. It's actually the colder temperatures are typically better for the diseases. We'll talk about that in a bit. But the COVID-19 seems resistant to heat, which is terrifying. So this is what I wanted to talk about in terms of cold. Um, there's been these conspiracy theories that mummies could be holding on to ancient bacteria and diseases, pestilence and stuff. That and that the curse of the mummy and all that kind of stuff. It's not the warm weather mummies that are the problem, so much as the cold weather mummies. So here on the right is a 900-year-old Russian. She's called the Polar Princess. She's from the Siberian regions. If you follow this kind of stuff, they found a mammoth recently in Siberia, about maybe 5 to 10 years ago, with flesh still intact. So it theoretically, if there's a bug that humans have developed an immunity to, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, but then we don't have that immunity anymore because we haven't needed it. That's terrifying. So here is the mummy of Ramses the Fifth, and I know I've already given away the good news that chances of getting illnesses from mummies because of the warm weather are slim. However, it's just crazy to think about that this guy died of smallpox, the same thing that wiped out more than 75% of Native Americans in New England in the 17th century. So the reason we don't hear much about smallpox anymore is this guy, Edward Jenner. He's the man who killed smallpox. He invented the first vaccination using cowpox in 1749. What's interesting, though, is it took another couple of centuries to actually get rid of smallpox because people have to be treated. They have to be vaccinated, right? So while the vaccine was invented in 1749, it wasn't until May of 1980 that World Health Magazine recognized that in 1979, the previous year, smallpox had been killed. Smallpox is dead. Tupac, maybe not. He's probably alive on an island with Marilyn Monroe, Kennedy, and Castro. But smallpox is dead. That's fantastic news because there's so many other bugs and bad things out there to get us. And one of the things I'd like to argue is that air conditioning has actually been a cause for increased illnesses because for the first time in human existence, humans are moving in large numbers or populations are growing in large numbers in areas that never had people. Think about parts of the Caribbean, the Central America in particular, as foresters get going deeper and deeper into the Amazon basin, Borneo, Indonesia. These are places that people traditionally did not have high population density in, and now we do because of air conditioning. So people, pollution, which leads to acid rain and carbon dioxide buildup, like we're creating an opportunity for disease, right? If you think about dead fish tides, that those are often human-based, and then they in turn create and become beds for disease. So what's interesting to me is the very things that we think of as being the so-called marks of civilization have also made us vulnerable to disease. And if you just think about it, like permanent settlement, right? That's a good thing, urbanization. But that also means people are in closer contact, as I said before, biomatter transfer. Irrigation, wonderful. But what happens if that irrigated water is contaminated? Domestication is fantastic. But now we're exposed to cross-species contact. Remember swine flu, avian flu, and even SARS through the bats. And the camels and MERS, like the cross-species contact. We saw COVID-19 has tested positive in a tiger, I believe it was, in the Bronx Zoo. Specialization increases the dependency and the need for human interaction and therefore biomatter transfer. Writing, the lack of literacy or the lack of writing can make people vulnerable. Religion and the disuse or distrust of medicine can make people vulnerable. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing classism rear its ugly head once more, or maybe just become more obvious here in the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. So movement between closed ecozones, right? The most famous one being the Columbus Exchange. The fact that closed ecozones all of a sudden come into contact with each other is an opportunity for pandemics and epidemics. Trade, biomatter transfer, culture diffusion, the diffusion of biowarfare technologies, maybe. There's rumors, there's suspicions that part of this COVID-19 may or may not have come out of a lab, and if so, it might have been a Chinese military government lab trying to keep up with the Joneses, in this case, the United States and Russia. Russia's shown a propensity to use biowarfare technologies in the last 10, 20 years, right? And so these revolutions in American well, American history, but also human history, have made us vulnerable. Agricultural revolution making us more dependent on specific seed engineered products. The scientific revolution, which brought that bio warfare technologies to fruition. Even just the industrial revolution, all have pollution, right? So science and technology definitely can impact the spread of disease. But what happens is we're making our planet sick, frankly. And so our planet's sick, and our planet's kind of striking back in almost a Dan Brown, Tom Cruise book combo movie deal of pestilence and the end of the world. Some kind of like Inferno was the name of that book and movie, right? That this guy wanted to have some kind of I don't want to call it social Darwinism, but to kill off a percentage of the human race to bring balance back to the planet's health. Um, so it can be done intentionally at times too. Psychopaths like in the book, in the movie Inferno, but government regimes like the United States and its laboratories in New Jersey and the Russian laboratories and China and who knows who else. Um, which then leads to pandemics and then an increased debate between where's the line between individual liberty and collective security. I don't want to wear a mask. You can't make me. I don't want to close my store. You can't make me. Where's the line between that? Where's the line between freedom and safety? So that's part one of this exploration of pandemics in American history. Now we're going to hit part two here, right? And part two is going to be about the pestilence and the disease itself. So we already talked about the history, what the names are, but let's go through some dates and some gross things about what they do to the poor human body. So many. Look at those dates. Like you got right from before the United States was created. If the English colonies are 1607 with Virginia and Plymouth Plantation 1620, and already you have a smallpox pandemic in 1633. And then it goes right up to 2010 in the United States was the last pandemic. That was the whooping cough, and then now COVID. So we're going to break them down into the two halves of the chart. So the pale horse of the apocalypse, the four horsemen. Let's see what we got here. So there's the smallpox, which we've been talking about, and it is horrible to look at. I don't know anybody who's had it. I cannot imagine. I hope it looks worse than it is. It wiped out, as I said, 70% of the Native American population just in 2 years in New England, 1633 to 1634. And the population of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire was roughly estimated to be about 60,000 Native Americans and another 20,000 Penobscot and other Native Americans in Maine. 70% of that you're talking about like 55 to 60,000 human beings dead in 2 years. Where do you put the bodies? And because those bodies then can become sources of more disease and pestilence, right? Declared gone in 79 by the World Health Organization, though. Thank goodness. Yeah, and for comparison, the Pequot War, which is roughly the same time period, only 8,000 combat fatalities. 60,000 people from a bug you can't even see. Only 8,000 from combat in the war. Well, I mean, the symptoms are fever, headache, backache, blisters, fatigue, vomiting. Oh, that's all just great. By the way, the sources for a lot of these charts and pictures are from Very Well Health, and they have wonderful information and infographics. Who's this guy? What? David Evans. 2017, virologist David Evans made headlines. He used synthetic biology to recreate a horsepox virus. That does not sound like a good thing, which is closely related to the disease that causes smallpox, the thing that we eradicated in 79 and declared eradicated in 80. What an idiot. And if you find the article and you read this, he bought it all on the internet. Nobody questioned him. You kidding me? And then there's yellow fever. Yellowing of the skin, jaundice, fever, bloody vomiting. And there's no cure, even today. You're welcome. In fact, in 1793, refugees leaving an epidemic in the Caribbean went to Philadelphia, didn't know they brought it with them, 5,000 Philadelphians dead, another 17,000 Philadelphians fleeing the city. So when you think about it again, in 1793, 5,000 people dead, boom, from the yellow fever. And that's in less than 1 year, right? In the entire course of the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, there's 8,000 combat deaths. 8,000 in almost 10 years, 5,000 in 1 year. Cholera. I didn't know that you could get cholera in the United States. I picture it as in third world countries with dirty water. And it is dirty water. But do you know, wait till you see the next slide, how many Americans died. This is an image on the right there. There's a man with cholera. And look at his hands. It's called washerwoman's hands. It's a sign of severe dehydration. Another major symptom interrelated to that is diarrhea. Cholera in the United States, there were 3 major waves. When you have to say there are major waves, that obviously means there's other waves too, right? So the second and the third waves hit in the 30s, the 1830s, and then the fourth wave hit right after the Civil War. An estimated 2 to 6 Americans dying per day. Per day. That's 200,000 Americans. In the second and the third pandemics were estimated to be 150,000 and another 50,000 in the fourth pandemic. And look at the chart from verywell.com. These crazy things that you can do to stop cholera. It's called washing your hands, cooking your food, being the person that peels your own fruits, drinking bottled or treated water. Like, this is not rocket science. Cholera, like I said, in those first 2 American pandemics, what are called the global second and third pandemics, 150,000 Americans died. Only 1,700 Americans died in the around the same time period in the Mexican-American War. What war are we fighting? I feel like we're fighting the wrong war here. In that fourth pandemic, the fourth global pandemic, the third one to hit the United States, 50,000 Americans died. In the U.S. Civil War, you remember when the Americans are on both sides, right? Every time somebody dies in the Civil War, it's an American, whether it's a Northerner or a Southerner. Almost the same number of Southerners died in the Civil War as did in the fourth cholera pandemic. I mean, at least in this case, God forgive me for saying this, at least humans who were spending their time shooting at other humans instead of bugs, more of them died. Scarlet fever is a bacterial infection that develops after strep throat. Oh, there's no cure. You're welcome. The White Plague, tuberculosis, we'll never know how many people died. We believe that it's probably the second largest cause of death in history. Probably smallpox is number 1, but you got to work the plague in there too. But we do know that the U.S. government says that the White Plague or the White Death, consumption, tuberculosis, TB, whatever you want to call it, these nodules, these tubulars, like the same word for for a potato, a tuber that grows in the ground, growing in your lungs and preventing you from breathing. The White Plague was a leading cause of death in the 19th century. Here's that stat from the National Institutes of Health, the Research Portfolio Online Reporting Tools. A century ago, TB, leading cause of death. And in Denver became, because of the weather, the high, dry air and all the sunshine, they built tuberculosis hospitals. One of them being the JCRS in Lakewood, Colorado. The great Dr. Charles Spivak and Dr. Philip Hilkowitz, who built JCRS and treated so many people of all denominations. And I can't get over this. And the plague in the United States. Well, I'm sure we took care of it, though. I mean, wait, what? When the bubonic plague first struck America, officials tried to cover it up. Dreaded Black Death shows up in California. 2-year political firestorm. So what happens is they find the plague And the health people are like, okay, this is the plague. We need to shut down. We'll clean it out. We got this under control. And the government said, the governor in particular, said, no, 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 I don't want businesses closed. That's bad for the economy. It's not true. Does any of that sound familiar? The bubonic plague, brought to you by verywellhealth.com. High fever, breathing constriction, these bubbles, the swollen circles building up and then opening with all that pus all over your black pus all over your body, the gangrene in your fingers, toes, nose, lips, the extremities, seizures, pain, your flesh dying on you while it's still attached. But the governor of California said it's not true, so never mind. But so the plague is going on during about the year 1900. 119 people that we know of died of the plague in San Francisco in those couple of years. In the Spanish-American War during the same time-ish, only 385 people died in a war. Just a couple of years later, on the other side of the country, 06 to 07, 20,000 New Yorkers die of typhoid fever. You know who that is in the picture? That's Typhoid Mary. She was a carrier but asymptomatic, and she infected people. And 100 years later, we have people walking around saying, I'm not sick, because they're asymptomatic. And what are they doing? They're spreading it. Typhoid fever. Typhoid fever killed, like I said, 20,000 people plus. In the Filipino-American War going on from 1898 until about 1904, 1906, 1,020 U.S. combat fatalities. So only 1,000 Americans die in a multi-year war, but 20,000 Americans die, and we don't know much about it. I learned about the wars in my history classes as a child. Don't remember taking or receiving much information about all of these diseases in American history. Lizzie Van Zyl, she was a prisoner in a British-run concentration camp in South Africa. She died of typhoid around the same time. And just look at that picture. Look at the disease-ravaged body. And there's more. This is so hard. There's so much pain and so much loss of life. Spanish flu, diphtheria, polio, measles, AIDS, dirty water, I can't pronounce that Latin word, and the whooping cough. The Spanish flu, 675,000 Americans died in 1 year. And in the same year and change, 53,000 Americans died in World War I. Again, are we fighting the right wars here? Diphtheria, which causes the swelling of mucous membranes, including in your throat, which makes it swell and then you can't breathe, you can't swallow. 200,000 cases in the 1920s, including 15,000 deaths. Polio, from 1960 up to 1952 was the pandemic. We know the president had it. And speaking of presidents with diseases, I should have said this before. The cholera epidemic killed President James K. Polk. And we know that the polio pandemic got to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. 57,000 people had cases. And the reason I include the cases and not just the deaths in the case of polio is because of the impairment to life, and yet you don't die. But 3,145 did. So 57,000 people get this neurological muscular disease of polio that ruins their life. And almost 300,000 Americans died in World War II in combat. The measles, like I said, I got a shot for this. I didn't know this was a big deal. I was alive during this pandemic. I didn't know what was going on. From 1981 to 1991, 2,000 to 10,000. Oh my God, that's quite the range. Are you kidding me? 2,000 to 10,000 Americans die each year. So if you do the math, and I'm going to do it with you right now, that's 10 years. So 2,000 times 10 is 20,000. And 100,000 would be if it was the 10 years times the 10,000. That's a range of 20,000 Americans to 100,000 Americans dead. And during that same time, the U.S. had combat missions going on all over the world. The El Salvador, Beirut, the Persian Gulf fleet escorts, the invasion of Grenada, Libya, Panama, the Gulf War, and all of those combined don't come anywhere near. It's like 600 or something people, which is horrible. But we're talking about 20,000 to 100,000 from measles. AIDS, since June 1981 to today, it's estimated about 700,000 Americans have died of HIV or AIDS. That's almost a million people, right? 750,000 people, including Ryan White, who died at 18 after being expelled from school for getting a disease that wasn't his fault. The great Magic Johnson, walking miracle. He's had HIV since November 1991, and he retired, then came back and played in the NBA, then made an All-Stars team, played around the world, ran the Lakers for a while, owns like every movie theater in LA. He's got money to take care of himself. God bless. And then this cryptosporidium, right? In 1993, 400 people got sick in Milwaukee, and out of the 400, 100 died. Dirty water. This is the United States of America. I mean, just remember what happened in Flint, Michigan, too. This is the United States of America. Dirty water. And whooping cough. 2010 to 2014 in the United States. That guy right there, handsome man, on the right, was one of the 10,000 cases that had it in the United States. And among those 10,000 cases, 10 infants died. So there's a lot of these pandemics that I didn't know much about until I started poking around and digging around. The entire history of the United States has been a history of pandemics. And yet I was only taught it was a history of war or a history of achieving liberty. Seems like the history of surviving pandemics. You look at these numbers of all these Americans that died in the pandemics and Americans that died in wars. I skipped a war. I skipped the Vietnam War. 47,000 Americans died in combat. Another 10,000 Americans died in Vietnam. A total of almost 58,000 Americans in Vietnam. The second longest war in American history. And in 3 months, we've already surpassed that because of COVID-19. 62,603 deaths as of today, April 28th, 2020. Oh, let's look at our budget. For those wars and the upkeep of the military, we spend $609.3 billion. I bet you know where this is going. The budget request for 2020 was only $6.591 billion. And before you think this is a partisan shot, it is not. You can go back and look at the history of these budgets. They're not much different. They're plus and minus $1 billion here and there over the last 10 years. 4 presidents almost, both political parties, and they're hovering budgets between $5, $7, $7.5 billion. And if you look at the other arrow, the one on the left, and you look down, specifically included, not in addition, but part of that $6.5 billion request for something that's been killing Americans for centuries is $727 million for immunization and respiratory diseases, like, I don't know, COVID-19. Only $700 million, but $600 billion for the Defense Department. And the immunizations, they're working, right? Like, we have vaccines for smallpox, cholera, TB, typhoid, diphtheria, polio, measles, cryptosporidium, and even the whooping cough. But you know, for example, we don't have vaccines for yellow fever, scarlet fever. The flu changes with the A strain every year. The plague, we had a vaccine. It's no longer approved by the U.S. government. And there is none. There's a cocktail of drugs you can take to hold HIV/AIDS in abatement, but there's no vaccine for it. And then the reason I caught the whooping cough in 2010 is because when I got the whooping cough shot as a child in the 70s, that the doctors had told the community, the world, the country, that it was a lifelong vaccine. Well, guess what? We found out it's not. It's only about, you guessed it, 30 years. And so I got it. How do we know these other things aren't coming back? Especially with the Russian princess from Siberia, the mummies coming out of the ice of the heatening planet that we live upon. So that's pandemics in American history. For further reading, check out Let me try that again, Charles David Spivak, a Jewish immigrant and American leader of the American Tuberculosis Movement by Dr. Jeannie Abrams, University of Denver. Phenomenal book, phenomenal woman, as well as The Most Dangerous Epidemics in U.S. History, which I used as a big source for this. That's Healthline, healthline.com. And the article in particular I want you to take a look at is about the government interference with medical research and abatement. When bubonic plague first struck America, officials tried to cover it up, by Andrew Lawler, National Geographic. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope this is as terrifying to you as it is to me.